Hey everyone, Meet Kevin here. Welcome back to another episode of the Meet Kevin Show. The last time we did an interview with George Gammon, we got over 323,000 views. George has such incredible perspectives about the market, economics, the balance between the free market and government. So we had to have George Gammon to talk about California politics and fixing California. I'm also going to be asking about the market here, since we've got a little bit of madness here recently in the market. But take a look at this awesome tweet, which is a great reminder for you to go follow George on Twitter. George Gammon says, "My good buddy, Meet Kevin. Kevin Paffrath is running for governor of California. We don't agree on everything, but I can tell you Kevin is someone who is truly motivated by principles and not power. #respect." Hats off, George. Thank you so much. First of all, for this, George, thank you for being here and welcome aboard. That was such an awesome tweet. Thank you.
Hey, no problem. You deserve it. Thanks for having me back.
Thank you. Thank you. So, George, let's start here. I mean, there are so many problems going on. We've got problems with the Fed. We've got problems in California. We've got craziness going on in the market. Let's go ahead and just dive right into California. What can we do to fix California? Then we'll move over to the markets. We'll maybe wrap up with the markets. How do you fix California, man? So much is broken. I just saw the sheriff of LA. The sheriff of LA just tweeted yesterday, I think it was, tweeted saying that essentially homelessness is such a problem. His hands are so tied. He's basically sitting, waiting for the city and the county to do something about it. Yeah. And the city and county can't do anything. It's just.
Yeah, they're all pointing fingers at one another.
Bingo. Nobody wants to take responsibility and do something. What's
I don't know. It's a very difficult problem because you've got so many entrenched, politicians and the sheriffs. I'm sure it just runs really deep. And then you've got all these regulations that are kind of constricting the free market from working and figuring out solutions to these problems. I mean, one of the things that I read that you were talking about with your run for governor is, freeing up the home builders to go out there and build homes by what, in essence, is streamlining the regulatory process for these guys to get building permits. And I was assuming that's where you were going with that. And this is what has to happen in California. I mean, you look at the homeless problem, a lot of it is due to mental illness, I'm sure. A lot of it is due to drug use, but a lot of it is due to just sky-high housing prices. And you can't fix sky-high housing prices just by lowering interest rates to try to lower the down payment so you get more people in the net of individuals that can afford the mortgage. That's not the long-term solution for housing. It's just creating enough supply to meet the demand. And you've got those builders. I mean, you're a real estate guy. You know this. You've got builders out there. They want to make money. Yeah, they want to make a profit. It's not like they're, we hate California. We're just going to go over to Texas and Florida and build homes there just because we don't like Gavin Newsom. Or I mean, they'll make money anywhere they can. But the problem is they can't make money there by building quote unquote affordable housing because of all the laws, the restrictions, the regulations. So you've got to get, one statistic that I found interesting. When I first got to economics, I really read Thomas Sowell a lot, and he's still one of my favorites. But he pointed out that the average income in California, or maybe in LA is very similar to what it is in Houston.
Okay. But
yet the average price per home is like a fraction in Houston of what it is in California or LA. And he attributed it directly to the very laissez-faire building restrictions that they have in Houston and more broadly in Texas. But you've got to do things to increase supply. The government is not going to increase the supply of housing on their own. They need entrepreneurs. They need home builders to take action. Therefore, you've got to create an environment that's conducive and is profitable and streamlined and efficient for them to build more housing, therefore bringing the overall price down, making it more quote unquote affordable. And then hopefully that, I don't think that would fix the entire homeless problem, but it would definitely help.
Oh, yeah, no doubt. I mean, there's so many issues going into homelessness, but on housing, and we'll hit these other things as well in detail, all very, very important. On housing, what do you say to folks though who say, "Well, wait a minute though, if we start building more homes, then yeah, that's gonna lower home values, but I already own a home and I don't want to see my values go down." You know, what would you say to somebody who has that concern, which is a real concern?
Yeah, you got to compartmentalize the question.
Mhm.
So you've got to say, okay, is what we're doing better for society at large, long term, or is it better for a couple individuals, short term? And
Mm.
the bottom line is, if housing prices artificially now, if it goes up due to demand, and then usually in a free market, the cure for high prices are high prices, and the cure for
Oh,
low prices, low prices.
okay.
But when we have a market that is restricted, like it is in California, to such a degree, you're not going to have those forces at play. So what happens is, sure, by housing prices continue to go up and up and up and up and up, you have the people that own those assets. Yes, they're becoming more wealthy on paper, but at
Mhm.
some point they've got to sell, and who knows what the price will be there. And also, too, I'd point out that the price that they see in nominal terms might not be exactly the price in real terms, adjusted for inflation.
Sure.
And that has a lot to do with it. So yes, you do have this small group of people, but then what happens to the other 99%? And a good example I'd use, Kevin,
Mm.
is my portfolio, my personal portfolio, and I'll bet that you can relate to this, is far larger today than it was in 2019.
Yeah.
Much larger. So my
Yeah.
net worth, as an example, to use this example, is a lot bigger. But right now, as we talk in 2021, I have access to far fewer goods and services. If I go out to try to go to a restaurant on Friday night, I've got to call 15 different places just to get a reservation. It takes me 45 minutes to get an Uber if I'm lucky. If I'm lucky.
Wow.
And those are just two anecdotal stories, but I'm
Yeah.
sure that all the viewers watching right now have experienced something like that. You go to the grocery store, there's no toothbrushes. Whether it's that, or you go to Ford and there's no semiconductors to create new cars, and therefore the cost of used cars skyrockets because they don't have enough pieces, because the supply chains have been disrupted. You see, so my point goes back to probably what we were talking about last time, and
Mm.
that's that you have to look at the wealth of a society as the amount of goods and services that it produces or has access to
Totally.
efficiently. It's
Yeah.
not the amount that's in your portfolio. It's not how many currency units you have in your bank account. It's goods and services. So I would say to that person, sure, your home price might go from $1 million to 1.5 million, but the environment in which you live will be far worse than it was before. And therefore, by my definition, you would be poorer, not richer.
Yeah. I mean, in some regard, this continued shortage is driving workers away, and it's exacerbating shortages in other areas of the market. To your point here, to where you're right. I mean, sure, market value of your real estate right now could look great, maybe not so much if you see interest rates go up, and then you're going to look around and go, "Wait a minute, where are the businesses?"
That's right.
Gavin Newsom led to 1/3 of restaurants going bankrupt in
That's right.
California with his lockdowns, and you're just going to end up getting more of that. That's a
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah. I mean, let's say that you had $1 billion worth of Bitcoin,
Yeah.
but you lived in Venezuela and you couldn't get
Mm.
out. I mean, how great would your life be? You'd rather have $1 million and live in Florida than $1 billion and live in Venezuela. And it's the same thing in California. Listen, if you look through history, it's not a secret. The places that have done the best are the places that allow free market capitalism to work. And notice I said free market
Mm.
capitalism. I
Yeah.
didn't just say capitalism,
Yeah,
because a
sure.
lot of people conflate the two. And
Oh,
you
yeah.
have to have free markets. That's where the magic is. In addition to the private property rights and the rule of law, and hopefully sound money and low taxes. And I know that lowering the tax rate, at least on the average Joe and Jane, is something that you proposed in your policy. I think that's a great idea. I don't know that that will prevent the kind of the 1% from leaving, the people that are producing the jobs, but at least it's a step in the right direction. That's for sure.
No, absolutely. Yeah. $250,000 free for the first of anyone's income. The question I have for you on housing here is, what is your take on building communities, allowing developers to build maybe outside of larger cities or further away than where we're used to them building now? So we're not necessarily just infilling with a bunch of new units and making things more congested, but building new planned communities in different areas, and then looking for potential private partnerships to build roads or tunnels or highways, maybe even with toll roads, to connect these to city centers so that people can efficiently actually get back to those city centers. I think very much of the suburbs around New York City. New York City, you get inside, it's so efficient. You've got trains that bring people inside. It's so efficient.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. And I'm not completely opposed to government, but what I try to stress is that government by themselves can't do anything. You need the entrepreneur. So you've got to start from the standpoint of what incentivizes the entrepreneur to come in and create that community that you referred to, or create the road, or create whatever. And even if the government builds the road, then you've still got to, it could be a road to nowhere, and that's just going to be a big waste of money. You have to have a multiplier effect. So then what brings in the producers? What brings in the capital? What brings in the know-how, the knowledge, and the human capital, the entrepreneur? Well, that's going to be a regulatory environment that doesn't change every other day, that's consistent, that's got relatively low taxes, and also to where the government narrative, let's say, isn't anti-business. It's not anti-entrepreneur. It's not anti-rich guy. I mean, you're a rich guy. You wouldn't want to go someplace where where you've got a target on your back nonstop, and where the and I'm all for employee rights, but I mean, I'm sure you've got buddies who do business outside of California, and there's no way you couldn't pay them enough money to build a plant or some sort of manufacturing business in California, because the rules are so lopsided in the favor of the employee. I don't think that most people, unless they've done business in California, would understand the degree to which it's lopsided. They hear me say that, and they're like, "Oh, George, well, you're just a retired entrepreneur. Of course you're going to say that." No, listen, I was an employee for a lot of my life as well. I get it from both sides. But I mean, if you looked, and I'm sure you've probably dealt with this in some of your homes, if you looked at some of the stories or some of the reality that happens in the trenches daily with employers and employees, I mean, it's the stuff of legend as far as how brutal it is to be an employer in the state of California. I mean, I wouldn't wish it upon my worst enemy. I have been ripped off by more employees in the state of California than I can count on both hands. And I'm all for fairness, but I'm not for the entrepreneur, the person that's got to create these jobs and make these things happen, really having a target on their back at all times.
Now, what are some examples of things that really stand in the way of that employer-employee relationship in California? I mean, even yesterday I posted a video about it. I was talking to an HVAC worker, and he's the head of sales, so he always comes out to my job sites. And he was saying, look, we're losing people hand over fist to Idaho, Nevada, and these are experienced, educated HVAC techs that are not easy to come by. And they're leaving. They're packing their bags and they're creating their own businesses somewhere where it's easier. And so we have this flight of talent, despite them getting educated here, this flight of talent out of California. What would you say is something beyond just taxation that can maybe bring folks back? What specifically?
You've got to lower the standard of the cost of living.
Mm.
And I think that circles right back to housing, and
Yeah.
that circles back to taxes from the standpoint of gas prices, the consumption tax.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got a lot of these HVAC guys, and look at, they're have to spend $1 million on some sort of shanty, and they could just go over to Idaho, and
Yeah.
with $250,000, they could buy an awesome house and give their kids maybe a better upbringing, maybe less social unrest. They don't have to pay $5 a gallon for gas or whatever it is now.
Right.
And it's just, and you don't have the homeless situation. So I think it starts. You're not going to be able to tackle this all in one swoop and just solve it overnight. It's
Not
you've got
overnight, that's
to
for sure.
really compartmentalize it and just chip away at it, just put one foot in front of the other, and just do that over and over and over and over and over again until you look back and you've walked a mile and you've really made some progress. But I think that's really, and another thing that you'd have to ask is, what are those other states doing well, right? Or what are they doing that's different than California? Why is that HVAC guy moving to Idaho, Nevada, Texas, Florida? And then you have to compare and contrast the two. And then at some point, California has got to realize that they've been riding on the coattails of this brand that they established, back in the 1960s and 1970s. And I'm sure it was well deserved, but they've got to kind of take a piece of humble pie and say, wait a minute, we're not as great as we were, and we need to be competitive again. We need to compete with states like Nevada or Texas or Florida, where all of our citizens are moving. What are they doing right, or what are they doing differently? And maybe we can learn from that. But it's very difficult because of the entrenched political parties that are there. The teachers unions, they've made a lot of promises that are very difficult to keep. When you allow people to retire at, and I don't know the exact numbers, but let's say 45 years old, and they retire with a pension of $150,000 a year, that's a really difficult promise to keep. And then that goes back to the Fed, that they've put CalPERS in this very difficult situation where CalPERS needed, let's say, a 7% return per annum to meet their liabilities to all those police officers and firefighters and teachers. And I don't blame the police officers, firefighters, and teachers. Don't get me wrong.
Sure.
I'm just saying that CalPERS made them promises that they most likely couldn't keep, but they definitely can't keep them if the Fed drops interest rates to zero. So the risk-free rate, meaning the rate on the 10-year, goes from, let's say, 7% down to, what is it now, 1.7, something like that?
1.66, yeah, something right there, yeah.
In 2020. And, you can say, sure, that's great for home prices. But again, that goes back to that divide between the haves and the have-nots. Do you own assets or do you not own assets? And if you don't own assets, those 0% interest rates and super low mortgages don't always benefit you, in the sense that it's unlikely that you'll be paid back what the state has promised you. And if you do get paid back, you'll most likely be paid back with dollars that buy a lot less.
Very good point. Yeah, and I think really your argument here that, gosh, I mean, there's so many problems together is so accurate. I mean, it's not just looking at homelessness. It's not just looking at housing or schooling or transportation. It's really all of those things, because they all impact your standard of living, like you had mentioned, or cost of living, which is one of the factors or reasons why folks are leaving. It's one of the reasons why and I know you looked over my plan, so I want to ask you some of the things you like and don't like, and we'll have a dialogue about those. But it's one of the reasons I think California needs a governor that is willing to say, we're declaring 4 states of emergency: transportation, housing, schooling, and homeless. And we're going to deal with it. We're going to do whatever we can in the first 60 days to make massive changes, whether that means calling in the National Guard and paying for it, and housing every person that's homeless, and then triaging them rather than trying to triage them on the street where they're dying. Well, that's what we'll do. But I want to hear your thoughts. Tell me a little bit more about what you read overall, what you liked and you didn't like.
Well, again, I think it goes back to just setting up a platform for in an infrastructure for the people that are really going to do the work, and that's
Yeah.
the people in the free market to get the job done and solve the
Yeah.
problems. Because government, in and of themselves, that they're not going to, even with you in charge, as awesome
No,
as you are,
no,
you
thank you.
can't do it all by yourself. You
Well,
need.
then I want to ask you this. So one of the big things, one of the big parts of my plan, which Fox Business was probably yesterday, their favorite part about my plan yesterday was my idea of future schools,
Yeah,
combining sort of
yeah.
vocational,
Love it.
right, trade, college, high school. The big goal there is really getting businesses to tell us, what do you need? What kind of jobs do you need? Teach our teachers to teach our children how to be models for those jobs, be financially educated, graduate debt-free at 18 with
Yeah,
the
right.
capability of going to work for these companies. So now we have this interaction between the companies telling us what they need, us educating the people, and then hopefully incentivizing the companies to hire and keep people local, which helps the
Yeah.
California economy. How do you like that partnership? Because I know there's the Peter Schiffian approach, which is just no government in school, right? But California's not going to go to that extreme. So what's your take?
Yeah, well, I think you've got to look at things two different ways. Number one, what would be the ultimate ideal, and that might be what Schiff is talking about. But then also, you can't build Rome overnight. How do you get from point A to point Z? Well, you got to go from A to B, and I think that's a good step to go from A to B. And the big problem right now, or one of the big problems, is these kids are getting out of college just with this shackled by student loan debt, and they've got a degree in which they really may or may not be able to pay that debt back, but you can't get rid of that debt in bankruptcy. They don't have any real skills to produce goods and services, although they may feel good about their degree. It really doesn't do much. So to consolidate that into a high school type of format that's more of like a trade school where they're learning something specific. And not only that, but they're learning about financial education. And that's something that you stress on your channel. Our good friend Kiyosaki talks about that all the time, Robert Kiyosaki. And it's just something that they don't teach in school, which is just mind-boggling, because that's the whole point, really, of going to college in the first place, in my opinion. It's to set you up to where you've got the skill set to succeed in life financially.
Yeah.
And they send you off there on your own, and they don't even tell you how to balance a checkbook, or they don't teach you about credit cards, or they don't teach you about getting a home loan.
Nothing.
Or interest rates. They don't tell you about the yield curve. They don't tell you about what money is or inflation. They don't teach you about any of that stuff. And that's what people really, really need to know. So if they could learn that by the age of 18, get out into the real world with even more skills that are needed, instead of maybe some skills that aren't so needed by the free market, but maybe feel a little bit better, and with no student debt, I mean, that's going to be a great thing.
Yeah. I mean, no kidding. And look, I always want folks to know too, I'm all for people learning those things if they want, but at least give a choice, right? You want to learn geometry, you want to learn financial education, you want to learn both, have a choice. But we don't have any of that right now. What you're saying is so true. People graduate at 18 are like, oh, I could get a $250,000 student loan and not worry about it until I'm 24 and I get hopefully a high paying job. Okay, great. Well, what happens 4 or 5 years later? Oops. It's like, wait a minute. My monthly student loan payment is $1,500, and my income's after taxes $3,000 or $4,000 a month. How am I supposed to get ahead? Can I qualify to buy a house? Nope.
Yeah, right.
Probably can't even qualify for a car loan.
It's buy a house. There's no chance. How do they buy assets? And if we built an economy, which we have, that completely revolves around ever increasing asset prices, how do those kids play the game? How do they get involved? How do they get ahead? There's no way they can get ahead, because the people, it's already an entrenched system where the people that hold the assets, they're the only ones that where their purchasing power is actually going to increase. The young kids, that generation, they've been priced out of the game. And when I was growing up, it was a lot different. The economy wasn't as financialized as it was today. And the way you got ahead was you knew you just had to go out there and work harder than everyone else. You had to start a business. You had to create a good or service that someone valued more than the money in their pocket. And when I was a teenager, prior to going to college, that's just, everyone knew that. It was a given. We didn't talk about the stock market. We didn't talk about investing in this, and this is how I'm going to get rich. The only way to get rich was to go out there, start a business, and work hard.
What about YOLOing call options?
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Now it's completely changed to where if you try that method, sure, you may be successful, you may not be successful, and even if you are, your taxes are going to be raised. You got that bigger target on your back that we were referring to yesterday. But the easier way to do it, and the more popular way, is just to gamble, is just to speculate, to your point. And that creates an environment where we're producing fewer goods and services. Therefore, by that definition I gave you earlier, society as a whole gets poorer and poorer and poorer. But one of the big problems there, in that one, maybe even a catalyst, is the student loan debt. Because if they weren't burdened by that student loan debt, then they could go out, they could save a lot more money. And with that money that they're saving, they could maybe start a business. And, the good news is nowadays it's a lot easier. The barrier of entry to start a business is a lot lower than it was when, I first got into the entrepreneurial game, because of the internet, and because, you and I can go out there and create content and give value that way. That didn't exist in the late 90s when I was getting into this.
That's such a good point. I want to ask, and I love that about the fact that, any of us, we could learn whatever we want on the computer or the device, quite frankly, that we're watching this on. It's really, really incredible.
Yeah, the overall basics that you learn in college, I think that's really obsolete right now, because you can just go to, the Khan Academy, as an example, and you can just learn it for free, just bam, 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 bam. Now, I get the specialty stuff. You need to go to school. You don't want to become a doctor just by what you read online. But for most of it, it's right there online. And back to your program, or what you suggest and what you lay out in your objectives, combining the high school and the college into more of a trade school type of atmosphere that's more focused on what the demands are for the local employers, in addition to financial education. I think that's a great idea.
Huge. Yeah, I do think some folks hear trade school, though, when they think of it as a negative, right? I
wouldn't want to call it a trade school,
right?
It's kind of the same idea.
It's a future school, but even future school too. It's sure the goal is folks actually being able to get a job at 18, which is also the goal of a trade school. But I think the combination of financial education and a college style curriculum, just sort of merging all of that starting at 14, is so key. We could cut out so much, and by combining, think about the budgetary effects too of saving. Now, I do get a lot of questions though from folks, and I want to hear your thought on this. Some folks wonder, well, wait a minute, Kevin, what about the unions? Wouldn't the unions be upset about this? Personally, I don't understand how the unions could not be devastated or very upset with the way California politics are today. It's impossible to get things done. It's impossible to grow wealth as a worker. It seems like the government is almost completely in the way. Now, so to me, I think the workers can get empowered by having less government in a way. What's your take?
I think it's going to be a tough sell, because
let's hear it.
You've got a lot of those union folks that have been and I don't blame them.
Yeah, of course.
They've been promised a lot of goodies, and a lot of times they're promised, in the future, a lot more than can actually be delivered. And if you're changing up the entire system, and those people see that as maybe jeopardizing their future financially, that's going to be tough. But I think it's a fight worth fighting for sure. The problem is you can't fix these huge problems with a solution where everyone wins. It doesn't work that way. There's no way you can do that.
Let me ask you this.
Yeah.
If you had a, which was one of the things on one of my plans, a California transition bond, where in the short term, you raise debt to bridge the gap of lower taxation, although we're going to be increasing revenue and increasing government efficiency and cutting a lot. You had a transition bond. And for example, let's go down to a local example. Let's say a teachers union, local teachers union. Let's say there's an offer. Hey, look, we're doing future schools. Who wants to work at future school? The pay is 2x, 3x, whatever. But the demands are greater. And folks can go to work for a future school if they want. There are going to be some folks who maybe say, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be a part of this transition. Is there not a way to say, hey, well, maybe here's a buyout offer. Do you want to be bought out and do something else? And now you're creating choice for folks. And certainly, I mean, never, I think, can you win in government by just trying to pull a fast one over someone, right? I think the goal is always looking for the best balance between everything. But I think there's a very good balance to be had between working with unions and promoting doing more and being able to be more productive and maybe bringing in higher pay and bringing in more educated folks than it only seeming like an us versus them. What do you think?
Well, I go back to one of my favorite sayings from Thomas Sowell, the economist we were referring to earlier. Yes. And he says, in economics, there are no solutions. There are only trade-offs.
Ooh, so sounds a little pessimistic.
You have to add, well, what you're dealing with is scarce resources, Kevin. So whenever you're dealing with scarce resources with alternative uses, there's always going to be a trade-off. As an example, you and I right now, or you're a family guy, you've got a couple kids, you're taking time out of your schedule to do this interview and to go live on YouTube. That's a trade-off because your time is a scarce resource that you will never get back. And so you're making a calculated decision there. Your kids, and to a certain degree, you are losing out because you're not spending that hour with your kids. So you see what I'm saying? So what would the trade-off be with what you're talking about? And unfortunately, there's got to be a give and take there.
Of course.
And I don't know how you solve the problem with more debt, because that's part of the problem right now. Is California's got a ton of debt, as does every single state. I don't want to isolate California there. I mean, state debt and corporate debt and sovereign debt is at all-time high. Consumer debt is getting very, very close. So
even margin debt, all-time highs.
Debt problem. And I don't know that just throwing money at the problem will solve it long term. One thing that I found interesting is when you take the average amount spent per student for the United States, the argument is, well, we just need to allocate more resources to education and therefore we will improve education. But I don't know that that's true, because if you look at how much, like South Korea, as an example, spends per student, it's a fraction of what we spend here in the United States. But the results are much, much better. So you have to ask yourself, okay, well, why is that? Well, I would argue that a lot of it has to do with culture, because in South Korea, they've got a culture that really, really, really prioritizes education and getting good grades. Again, that's got pros and cons, but I don't know that just throwing more money at it solves the problem. But I do like, giving people the choice, and not only giving the teachers the choice, but also giving the consumers, if you want the consumers of that education, the choice to do what they want as well.
I couldn't agree more. I want to say I think one of the issues in California is California has taken this stance of, well, we don't need to do anything right now. And it's been this nonchalant attitude that you've even seen with Gavin Newsom. Oh, I'm not worried about Tesla leaving. Direct quote from Gavin Newsom. Well, as soon as you start taking, as soon as you start compounding year after year. I mean, this guy's been in power for 17 years. As soon as you start compounding this, what you had mentioned, it's kind of like the way I almost think of it, like you had a great analogy. It's this brand that was built in the 70s and 80s, this golden brand, or the 60s and 70s, excuse me, this brand that was built to represent luxury, the Golden State, prosperity, right?
Sunshine.
And I think of it
And
almost
by
like
the way, and freedom.
and freedom. Yeah, I think of it almost like, let's say you're really used to getting Hugo Boss suits, and they've always been great. But then year after year, they're like, it's not so important that the stitching's perfect.
Right.
And then just this compounds over 17 years, and then all of a sudden you go back into a Hugo's. What happened? This is not the quality it used to be. The threadings, it doesn't match. The stitching's bad. It's falling apart over here already in the store. What is this? I almost think that's a similar thing that's happening with California. I mean, we see California crippling around us. It's worse than the stitching on a suit, right? I mean, the homelessness is ridiculous. It's toxic, the fact that people are dying on the street in California. People don't even feel safe outside anymore. But beyond that, I think the solution is not one-sided by any means. It's not, let's throw in more money. That's what Gavin Newsom's trying to do. He's trying to buy votes and just throw more money. We need more money for the high-speed rail, $125 million per mile. Sure, here's another $4 billion. What's another $4 billion, right? Meanwhile, Elon Musk can build you a tunnel for $10 million a mile, 1/12 the cost, right? No free market at all in the consideration of the high-speed rail. It blows my mind. So, point here is, and I want to ask your opinion on this. Would you agree that California needs a comprehensive solution that might mean an investment now, but at least yields a path towards a return, a substantial return on that investment, by addressing all of the systemic issues as best possible from the top, with homelessness, housing, transportation, getting the private market involved, the future schools, whether that's legalizing gambling as well, or reforming courts to the extent that we can, doing as much as possible to make that brand great?
I think there is a path to achieve what you're describing.
Yeah.
But it would have to also include just a huge reduction in the amount of regulations, and also most likely taxes. Because see, here's the deal. And I've got a lot of firsthand experience with this as far as infrastructure spending is what you're talking about with the government, and that having a multiplier effect. So if you take on, the idea is you take on debt right now, let's say take on another 100 billion in debt, and then you spend that into the real economy, building a rail system, as an example, that would create more.
I don't like the rail, but go ahead. Yeah.
So therefore, maybe these communities would have access to jobs, and whatever your game plan is there. Well, that's fine, but you have to ask the question: what happens next?
Yep.
You see, so the reason there's a multiplier effect is because once you build that infrastructure, let's say a highway or a road that didn't exist before, then you speed up the transportation of goods from point A to point B. And then along the way, the idea is that you build these communities, you build grocery stores, gas stations, and all this commerce sprouts up as a result of the highway. And then you have a multiplier effect with GDP that brings in more tax revenue in the future to pay down the debt of the initial bond sale that generated the money in the first place.
Yep.
Okay. Well, in Ecuador, where I've spent a lot of time, they did the exact same thing. This little
wait. Is this the example of the road to nowhere?
Basically it's a road to nowhere. Why didn't what happened there? I probably told the story last time, but what happens is, let's just say California spends this money on infrastructure that's supposed to have this multiplier effect. Well, okay, if you don't reduce the taxes, if you don't reduce the regulation, let's say you increase them, well, there isn't going to be any builder to build the communities. There's not going to be any entrepreneurs to start the convenience stores or the gas stations or the movie theaters or the grocery stores or anything along the side of the highway you just built. And therefore, it's to your point, it's just going to be a road to nowhere. So you've got to do both. If you want to invest the money, let's say, into a plan like that, you have to also create an environment that's conducive and incentivizes capital and producers to come in and build what you want around the infrastructure that you just created.
Yes, could not agree more. I want to ask you this. Privatizing roads, certain roads. Private companies will not build a road to nowhere. There are downsides and there are positives. What's your take?
Well, I think that there's been a lot of success on the East Coast with private toll roads. That's for sure, where you just want to go somewhere quicker, and they're more expensive. But it's if some people are willing to pay the cost, then fine. So I think they've had a lot of success. I know I've built roads that have had a lot of success as well. I mean, I developed a piece of property in Portland, Oregon, and I built a road. So I had a property that I subdivided. And so I used the subdivided lot to build a new house, but you couldn't get there because there's no road. So I actually had to get it approved, and I built a road and paved it to get to the house so I could sell the property. So there are ways to do this. And I don't know that I'd go so far as to say that all the roads should be privatized, but I think it's a great idea. And especially if you give tax incentive, like future tax incentives for groups to come in and do that, then, but again, it would have to be overall. You can't just pick and choose and use this crony capitalism.
Oh gosh, that's the worst.
To say, okay, well, we're going to give the contract to these guys, but we're not going to do anything else. And we're just going to expect everyone else to come in and create all these jobs and all these businesses, while at the same time we're jacking up income taxes to where you got to pay 90 cents out of the dollar for every bit of profit that you make. I mean,
it's a disgrace. It's a disgrace.
Trust
me, I know. Yeah, the crony capitalism is another thing. I had Ali Maz on. He had this really good point. He's like, Kevin, we've never had a politician, YouTuber really, who will just be 100% transparent about everything. Like, you want to see the good, the bad, the ugly? Here's everything, and that to me, with a more transparent government can be, the more of a free market you have. If you have, a builder getting a contract saying, oh, well, we'll build this road for $100 million. Meanwhile, you got 5 other contractors like, we can definitely do that for 50 mil, and they're all at 50 mil. Why is the one getting it for 100 mil, right? Why are they getting the contract? So, I could not agree with you more. I want to ask you about one of the initial ideas, things that I think is such a high priority on incentivizing, is tunnels specifically under areas of high congestion, so that you could create variable toll roads where you charge variable amounts of money, and they're optional. So that way it's not like a regressive tax against folks who can't or don't want to pay the toll. They have the option of using a regular existing highway that goes
that's the way it works
in
in the East Coast in a lot of areas.
Tell me more.
Well, I just recall when I lived in Maryland, I had an office in Tyson's Corner. Okay. And I can't remember what the name of it was, but there was one main highway that would go there that was always just traffic. Or you could take this other road that was a toll road, and the toll was pretty expensive, like $3 or $4. But it was fast, and it was run by a private company, and it was beautiful. I mean, no potholes. I mean, it was immaculate, and that's the direction that I always went. So I think that's kind of along the lines of what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so you're in support of private development of roads where it makes sense. I mean, it has to make business sense. What about, if you build, what's your stance on subways and buses? Because sometimes, often you hear people think about tunnels and they're like, oh, you're just talking about tunnels for people. Well, wait a minute, but you could also build tunnels for subways and buses. What's your take on mass transportation? I mean, this is something that New York City has gotten so down. Why don't more places do that?
Well, because they don't have as consolidated a population. I mean, I think that San Francisco has it down. I mean, if you look at BART,
BART
I
system.
remember when I lived on Twin Peaks in San Francisco way back in, what was that, maybe 2000, 2001. I remember I moved there from Vegas, and I brought my car with me, and I don't think I ever took my car out of the garage once the whole time I was there, because it was a big hassle. You know, you could just go down to the BART station and take BART into town, which I think is Bay Area Rapid Transit, what that stands for.
Yep.
And that was a much better way to get around, and therefore everyone used it. Now that said, though, I know that up in Portland, they did not a subway, but it's I forgot, like a rail car system, and that wasn't as much of a success. You know, they sold it as though it was just going to be this game changer, but there wasn't much demand for it, because it's much more spread out, and it was a lot easier to drive your car. So I think there would have to be a proper analysis done of, okay, how much is this really going to move the needle in some place like Los Angeles? And then, you know, unfortunately right now, because these politicians are so crooked, they could have some, you know, $20 billion program, you know, railway tunnel system that they're not doing to benefit society at large. They're simply doing because their buddy owns the tunnel company, and their buddy's going to give them a $100 million kickback. I
hate that so much. Just hearing that it's not what government should be. And I think almost I mean, it's criminal to see so many times we hear, oh, the government's going to throw more money at a problem, but the funnel goes like this. It's like, here's $100 billion going in, and it's like we got like 10 billion of benefit. Like, where's all the money going? It's atrocious. I mean, it's quite frankly, it's a crime, wasting the people's money like this. What would you say? So we touched on future schools. You like the idea of future schools. You like that optionality. What's your take on student loans and student loan grants to go to colleges if, let's say, you had future schools established?
I wouldn't give student loans. And because what student loans do is just increase the price of college. And sure, and then you get to a point where everyone has a degree, and it's not really worth much. When I went to college, you know, not that many people had a degree. I would say maybe 20, 30%, something like that. Now everyone goes and they get burdened with $250,000 of student debt, but yet every single person has a degree. So, you know, what's the difference between you and someone else? There's not much difference. So I don't think that a college degree today has much value at all. Definitely not $250,000 worth of value. I think you have far more value in the future school that you were talking about, combined with what people can learn on the internet, especially if you're getting a lot of input from the actual employers in the local area, and you know, telling you and the teachers and what the students, what they actually are willing to pay for.
You know, it seems so simple, yet our colleges today or our high schools today, I mean, maybe some small segments have, oh, well, we have internship connections, or we're going to work with these companies, whatever, but it's rare. I mean, I think there was a community college in Los Angeles partnering with Amazon, but they're talking about partnering with them to be drivers on the side. We're not actually talking about, hey, look, these are the kind of coders we need. These are the kind of robotics engineers we need. Let's come into the schools and teach the robotics. Why is it that hard? I feel like Amazon, I mean, I know businesses would love to educate more people. Even the HVAC person I met yesterday would love to have more educated HVAC techs coming out with a skill at 18. Come work for an HVAC company. You know what I mean?
Yeah. See, the issue is you're trying to get into government, but your biggest problem is government. And what you're talking. So let's just look at the employee issue for a moment. Well, right now, I mean, there's a huge shortage of employees because the government is paying people to stay home.
The federal government,
yes. And I'm not here to say that the stimulus checks were a bad idea or whatever. But again, let's just look at the economic realities. There are no solutions. there are only trade-offs.
Mm.
So if you give someone money for staying at home, the trade-off is going to be they're less incentivized to actually go to work. Just the way it is. So then you have the government competing with employers to get those smart employees to come back to work, maybe learn new skills. And then you have the government with the distortions of the financial economy that we talked about before, that are incentivizing people to go out and not learn skills that will help them produce goods and services, but learn skills that will help them gamble in the stock market by buying call options on GameStop or something like that. You see, that's what we are incentivizing now. I'm talking about the government and the Fed is incentivizing now by what they started doing way back in 2000, but really put fuel on the fire in 2008 when they dropped rates down to 0%, do all this quantitative easing. And now that we've seen, now that you have the lockdowns, you're forcing people to stay home, you're forcing businesses to shut down, and then you're paying people more than they would make at work to stay at home and not produce goods and services. You see, so that's kind of one battle that you've got to fight first and foremost. But assuming that you're specifically talking about the kids that are currently in school, I mean, I think everyone would agree that's a fantastic idea. So what's the big problem? It goes back to the entrenched interests of the parties involved. What's the saying that you can never get someone to understand something if their salary depends on them not understanding it, or something to that effect, right? Sure. And it's the same thing right now with the college professors that you have in all of these schools. I mean, you've got a massive bureaucracy in the universities in the United States, and they all benefit from kids being $250,000 in debt and having access to all these student loans. So if you go up there and say, hey guys, I want to create future school, they may say, well, that's a great idea, but what that's going to mean is a lot less college instructors, and that bureaucracy that you've built up over the last 20 years is going to have a lot less power. You're gonna have some pushback there. So, but I think it's a fight worth fighting. That's the bottom line. And another thing I want to emphasize too is we're talking about politicians who are in power that have done a bad job. And unlike yourself, the politicians that we have now are not there or are not motivated by principles. They are motivated by power. That's the only thing that motivates them. Let's be very, very clear. But why is it that the government attracts so many scumbags, for lack of a better word, right? And attracts so few people like Kevin? Why is that? Because the government has so much power to begin with.
Oh, wow.
Right?
Wow.
If you reduced the amount of power the government had at a state level, especially at a federal level, then you would have far fewer crazy people wanting those positions. Or said another way, you'd have far fewer people that have an insatiable lust for power and to control other human beings going out there and campaigning for those positions in the first place. One of the things that I've done a lot lately is studied pre-World War II Germany. And I understand we're on YouTube right now. I won't say the name of the group I'm talking about. But
okay. So starting in like 31, 32 to like 44, that group.
Yeah.
Okay. It started with art, right? Okay.
Yeah, there you go. So
okay.
You have to ask yourself, the person and the individuals that came into power in Germany, would they have even wanted that position of power if the government was the size of the United States government back in the late 1700s?
Oh, George Washington days kind of thing.
Or prior to the Fed. Prior to the Fed, government spending was about 3% of GDP. 3%. That's how small the federal government was. So would you have had a Mussolini, I can probably say that word, would you have had a Stalin, as an example, if Germany Or, would you have had any of the crazy politicians that we've had lately if the government spending in that particular country was only 3% of GDP? In my opinion, is absolutely not, because those power-thirsty individuals would have had to find that power somewhere else. It wouldn't be in government. So I don't think I think one of the solutions to talk about is getting better politicians. But I think an even better solution is to reduce the size of government in the first place.
Aha. Now, one of my thoughts, it kind of goes back to housing, is that we have so much fragmented government that we have 482, municipalities with their own building and safety departments, and then you've got even overlays. I mean, it's a mess. One of the ideas is initially making this a statewide institution, and using that to streamline and simplify the government's role. Because one of the things that blew my mind was, and this is the kind of, I hear this stuff day in, day out in real estate. This is just such a salient example. As yesterday, HVAC person suggested or told me that this one city now requires a structural engineer, and that structural engineer's report has to be submitted to the planning department for review, just to replace an attic furnace, like for like, the same spot, now requires planning. So you're talking 6 weeks to get an attic furnace replaced, which is totally moronic. Personally, I believe one of the ways to get the government out of the way, and want to hear your thought on this, is, look, we already license architects, contractors, HVAC pros, engineers. They already have insurance. They already take liability. They already have bonds. Let them certify 99% of the small projects. What's your take on that?
Absolutely. And I think you could take it 100 steps further than that. No. And I mean, at what point is there too much regulation?
Yeah.
And then at what point maybe is there not enough? And I think that if you look at, let's look at the amount of housing regulation in Houston, again, using that as an example. Well, are the buildings just falling down everywhere? I mean, do we have all of these problems where, kids are being trapped under, bricks and roofs that are caving in and whatnot? No, you don't have that. But I can guarantee you've got a lot fewer regulations. And I can guarantee you that because just look at the price of the houses. So you could say, okay, you got too much, but the best way is to just streamline that, cut out the fat. The problem is when you create another government agency, what happens is the sole purpose of that agency internally is just to continue to exist.
Wow.
They don't have a profit and loss. They don't have to do a good job. Right. There's nothing. The only thing they have to do is spend their budget to make sure they get an even bigger budget the very next year. Let's go back to Thomas Sowell. One of the stories he told when he was young in college, he was a self-proclaimed socialist. Mm-hmm. And I've heard him in a lot of interviews say, okay, well, Tom, how'd you go from that to being a real free market guy? He says, oh, it was easy. I just worked for the government for one summer. And what happened is he worked for the, I believe it was the welfare. It was either an agency that dealt with welfare or the minimum wage. It was something like that. Okay. And he went to work on this study that would show all of these solutions to reduce the amount of people that were on welfare. I think that was it. We'll assume that was it.
Sure.
And when he took it to his boss, the guy looked at it. He says, "Tom, what are you doing? No. Don't just. Let's throw this in the trash here. You don't understand." He says, "If you reduced welfare by 50%, we would all be out of jobs."
Oh, wow.
You see, that's the moment he realized that this government central planning stuff doesn't work because, and I'm not blaming that people. Listen, as human beings, we're going to pursue our own self-interest.
Of course.
And the interest of our family. That's just the bottom line. That's just the way we're hardwired. That's why we didn't go the way of the dinosaur, right? So assuming that to be true, the people in government are going to pursue their own self-interest just like the people in corporate America or the banksters or anyone. So if they don't have a profit and loss, you see, that's the magic right there. In the private sector, if you do a bad job, you're out of business. You're done. And again, this is why I say free market capitalism, because in crony capitalism, that's not necessarily true. You can get bailed out by the Fed. But in a true free market, if you do a bad job, the market's going to speak and you're going to go bust. If you're a bad landlord, you're not going to have any renters. You're not going to be able to pay your debt. You're going to go bust. This is why Milton Friedman always says that the loss is just as important, if not more important, than the profit. You have to have both. And so with the government agencies, they don't have a profit and loss. So there's nothing there that requires them to do a good job. In fact, they're perversely incentivized to actually do a job that's counterproductive for the greater good of society. And that Thomas Sowell's story is a good example.
It's so perfect, because what's crazy is I'm reading a lot of earnings transcripts. And in these earnings transcripts, we're seeing almost every single company saying the same thing. We are making our company more efficient by digitizing and streamlining workflows to offset the pricing impacts of inflation. Now, we're not going to do an inflation debate, but the point here is the private market, the private sector is responding. They're responding to inflation. Okay, where can we cut? How can we still increase margins while facing higher prices? Based on what you're saying here, and what would be a logical conclusion is, the folks working in government don't even notice inflation because there's no profit and loss. There's no margin. There's no profit margin you got to pay attention to. No, who cares? Who cares if the ream of paper is now $20 instead of $5? It doesn't matter.
And a lot of times it's actually better, because it means that you're going to spend your entire budget. Therefore, the next year, your budget is going to increase. See, but let's kind of dig deeper into what you're saying. You're saying all these companies are talking about how they're going to solve the problem of inflation. Well, who created that problem?
It wasn't J-Pow.
It wasn't. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Printer go brrr, right? Where they're increasing M2 money supply by 25% in 2020, while the unemployment rate goes up to 15%. So if the unemployment
rate, transitory.
Yeah, we'll see. Yeah, when copper prices, lumber prices, every single input price has gone through the roof. I just saw an article on Bloomberg yesterday that said that we are facing a global shortage in everything. Those were their words, not mine. I actually did a whiteboard video on it today, and it makes a lot of sense. When you have all of these additional currency units that are chasing a fewer amount of goods and services, because you're locking people in their house and you're paying them not to go to work, you've got one direction to go for consumer prices, and that's up. Now, can it get to a point where it goes straight up, plateaus, and then starts coming down? Yeah, because our whole system wants to deflate because of the amount of debt. But what's happening is the government, and combined with the Fed monetizing the debt, is just acting as this huge counterbalance that are creating so many more currency units, reducing the amount of goods and services. And therefore, you see those prices going up. That's why all of your viewers, I'm sure the last time they went to the grocery store, or for the last few months, they've been shocked at the prices. I remember reading an article from Reynolds Wrap. They're increasing. I think they've even increased prices like 3 or 4 times just in 2021. But you go down the list of all of these producers that make the stuff that you buy at Walmart, that you buy at Target, they're all increasing their prices. And you point the finger, it goes right back to the government, and then it goes back to the Fed, because the government wouldn't be able to do that if the Fed wasn't monetizing the debt. You know, if the government was just issuing bonds to create those currency units, they'd be pulling the money out of the real economy and then putting it back in. So on net balance, broad money, M2, really wouldn't go up that much. But what's happening is they're creating new currency units because they're not extracting the money out of the real economy in the first place. What's happening is the Fed is just creating bank reserves to buy those treasuries almost directly at auction. And therefore, when Janet Yellen sends out those checks, that's new money supply. So I don't want to go off on a tangent, but I just had to point out that that you see the private sector just always trying to solve the problems that are created by the central planners.
Now, obviously, on a state level, there's not much a state can do about Jay Powell and his relationship with Yellen. I think you had mentioned usually it's the banks borrowing, but now it's the government. And this is how we're creating this extra money. So, from a state point of view, does one of the things that I've considered is, hey, look, if Biden's going to make college free or community college free, sounds like it's going to pay for a lot of our future schools. From a state point of view, it seems like a benefit. Now, I know there are broader implications there, but from a state point of view, some of the things could actually be helpful in maybe transitioning. What do you think?
Help me understand your point a little bit better. You're saying because the community colleges would be free, how would that benefit the future school?
Well, if we rebrand our future schools as a type of community college, now essentially you're providing community college education in the form of a future school. So really, if community colleges are now free and paid for by the federal government, this potentially is another avenue for the state of California to reduce their budget deficit while also making the whole process much more efficient. Like, for example, one thing that drives me nuts about schooling is that, and I think teachers would agree, why are we giving the same lecture on repeat? There's a video camera that everybody has in their pocket that can give the same lecture on repeat. And we could be using that effort to teach hands-on learning or hands-on education so people can actually graduate with a skill at 18. But I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first, nothing's free. Right?
Well,
there's no
Fed's paying for it, but I know what you mean.
It's either going to be paid for with future tax increases or through inflation. So you've got to understand that. And then also it goes back into the topic of creating bigger government and what type of slippery slope that puts us on, right? So if the government comes out and pays for community college, yes, absolutely, that would benefit your future school. But it doesn't happen in a vacuum, right?
Sure.
So what that does is that would increase the power of government and therefore increase the amount of crazy people that are applying for those positions. And after, Kevin, if you become governor of California, I mean, you're going to do a fantastic job. I'm sure of that, but you're not going to be there for the rest of your life.
Nope.
You see, and that's the problem is we grant it when our guy or gal gets in power, we want the government to have all the power in the world. Oh yeah, sure. Do this, do executive order that, executive order this, just keep doing that. The problem is when the next guy or gal gets in there that isn't benevolent.
Oof.
They're power hungry and they're going to use that power against you. And that's what people really don't understand. So, I like to start off with the basics to understand the bigger picture. So whenever I'm talking or whenever I'm thinking through like stimulus checks as an example, I always say, okay, does this create more goods and services in the future or fewer? And that's how I determine, is this on balance a net positive? But see, I'd say the same thing about that idea. Is this creating bigger government? Is this creating more government or less government? And unfortunately, that would, I think, create more government. So I would like to try to figure out a way to do these future schools, which I think is a fantastic idea, without increasing the size of the federal government. The state government, I don't like it increasing, but it's better than the federal government because, see, the states can compete against one another. True. And that's one huge advantage that we have here compared to, let's say, a Colombia, where I spend a lot of time. And, if you don't like what's happening right now as far as the restrictions due to, we'll call it the cerveza sickness, and you live in California, well, great, you can go to Florida. Because it's way different in Florida. I can tell you that from personal experience. So, and then after this is all said and done, that people can go back, look through the data and say, okay, well, this state did maybe some things better than this state. And you go back and forth. You've got completely different policies, and you can compare and contrast to come to a conclusion on, what worked best. Yeah. And that's one of the benefits of having states compete. So my point is, if we have to increase the size of government, I don't want to do it, but if we had to, I'd prefer that it was done at a state level and not the federal level. The federal level is just bad news. We always talk about decentralization, and that's one of the great things about Bitcoin. It gives power to the people. It decentralizes the banking system, as an example. It decentralizes money to a point where we could have sound money. We could have hard money. We could have a deflationary type of money system, again, which would benefit the poor, would benefit the middle class, the average Joe and Jane. So whenever you see decentralization, usually it's a good thing. So the opposite of that, by definition, would be a bad thing. So whenever we're
I see what you're saying. Yeah,
power, that's fair. Not so good.
Yeah, and I think I mean, I can't agree with you more on it. There's so many things California just gets in the way of. Housing is a perfect example. Solving homelessness is another example. And a lot of these things I think can be changed with clear, streamlined processes. I know they can be changed because, like you said, look at our competition. Look at the other states, right? But I want to ask you, what's your take on things like privatizing all or parts of the DMV?
Yeah. Oh, I think it's a fantastic idea. I mean, it could be run so much more efficiently than it's run right now. And I mean, that what they're doing now is really kind of, I mean, I don't want to go too far off on a tangent, but it's really going in some personal freedom issues that I and many other people, I think, probably aren't too comfortable with the direction they're going as far as facial recognition and a lot of other things. But that gets back into the corporatism and crony capitalism when you understand that. I know, and I don't know how it is in California, but in Arizona, all of the back end stuff that the DMV does there is Microsoft, and you're like, I don't know if I want Microsoft to have access to my driving record and everything else. But anyway, that's a whole other topic. But yeah, I mean, I think there's so many ways to streamline it. But again, when you're dealing with an agency or a group of people that aren't incentivized by efficiency, they're incentivized by the opposite. It's very difficult to crack that nut. It's like you've got to create a different incentive structure to solve the problem. You can't just go in there and say, okay, well, we need to be more efficient. Let's just do this, this, and this. Because at the end of the day, you'll have people that will rebel against that because it's not in their best interest. So you've somehow got to align the interest of the government agency, whether it's DMV or anyone else, with the interests of the general public and the private sector. I think that's where the magic happens.
Thoughts on legalizing gambling? Yeah.
I mean, people are going to do it anyway. Yeah. So I'm a libertarian, so I think that should be legalized. I think that that drugs should be legal. I think marijuana is legal there already, and they're taxing it. But yeah, I think that would be a great idea. I don't, what's weird also is, prostitution. I think that should be legalized.
It's legal in Germany.
Yeah, well, it's legal everywhere other than the United States. And so that was my point, going back to gambling. When you travel through Europe or go to Australia, I know that was one of the first things that I noticed when I went there, is that gambling was legalized. And you think that everywhere's like the United States, and you're like, well, wait a minute, people aren't becoming degenerates, here in Australia. So maybe it's not so bad as we think in the United States. But yeah, I think that would be great. You'd fill a lot of or at least a portion of the hole in the taxes. And I think it's a step in the right direction for sure. And it's if the free market wants it, then they're going to get it anyway. So why not just set up a system that works well for both parties and use it to generate some revenue for the government?
What do you think about immigration? Obviously, it's a big federal issue, but there are also limitations on corporations bringing a certain amount of people in with the skills that they need because they can't find them locally because the state has failed in educating people. But then there's also legal versus illegal immigration. Any thoughts there?
I think we should have open borders.
Okay.
But you'd also have to eliminate welfare.
Oh, wow.
That's the catch. So if you have welfare, you can't have open borders. There's no way, because then you've got to be able to pick and choose who you want coming in and who you don't want coming in. And I think we're doing a horrible job of that. I mean, I could give you another personal story. My architect and my designer in Colombia are Ecuadorian. They have an Ecuadorian passport, and they are two of the smartest, most skilled individuals I have ever met in my life. I mean, top shelf, just great character. I mean, just a huge amount of integrity. They are the people that you would want coming to the United States. I mean, it's just everything you could want. They fit the bill.
Wow.
But they have tried to get into the United States, not to live here, for heaven's sakes. They've just tried to get a visa to visit and just to come, because I wanted to bring them here to show them a couple of my real estate projects. No chance. There's absolutely no way you can do that. But yet you go and see all the other people that are coming in for a variety of reasons, and you're like, wait a minute here. I mean, I get it. We want to, we want to be open to a lot of different groups, but if we're going to have to choose between the people who are going to come in and produce and are extremely competent and have a high degree of character and integrity, shouldn't we choose those people over maybe someone else that might not fit into that category? So I mean, I think that you've got to change the way you select the groups. I know there's been a big call for that in Silicon Valley as well, because you have all these really, really smart, educated folks from Asia that Google and Facebook want to bring over, but they just can't because they can't get a visa. But ultimately, I think the best solution, because it reduces the size of government, would be to eliminate welfare and then have a system that's more like an open border, where if you want to come in, you can come in, but just understand that we're not going to give you anything. And if you don't produce, you're going to fail.
Yeah, it makes sense entirely. The welfare, or on welfare, right now, welfare requires that you're, in many cases, or at least before COVID it did. I'll get an update on for now. But welfare generally requires that if you're able to work, that you're looking for work, or that you work. It seems that oftentimes these jobs tend to be lower wage, lower skilled jobs to meet that requirement. And folks essentially get trapped on welfare. They're not able to get out of poverty, essentially. So they're stuck on welfare. And sometimes this, disproportionately affects minorities. It can disproportionately affect single mothers, even single fathers. And so a question is, wouldn't it make more sense if you had welfare to say, maybe instead of just working any job, instead you attend a future school, or maybe it's a choice. You attend a future school. And maybe you even have future schools carved out for homeless rehabilitation and for prison reintegration. So that way, folks, when they go through schooling, they can not become homeless again, not go back to jail, not go back on welfare, because they actually get a job that gives them dignity and actually provides value to a business, and they actually earn a substantial wage. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the first thing I'd like to point out is that PR announcement where you said that you're running for governor. If my memory serves me right, you went to California with $1,000 in your pocket to your name at 17 years old. And how old are you now?
29.
29. So basically a decade later, you're a multimillionaire on YouTube.
Yeah.
Okay. So, how did you do that? You're just like me. I mean, you don't have a 200 IQ, but what you do is you go out there and you hustle. And you work your ass off. And I can guarantee you nobody works harder on YouTube or anywhere for that matter than Kevin. There's just no way. So you went out there and busted your ass and made it happen. And I think that I understand not everyone can do that. I totally get it. But I think a lot more people could do that and would be incentivized to at least, make something of their lives if they weren't in the welfare system to begin with. I think that welfare, although it does benefit a few, again, there are no solutions, just trade-offs here. So you can't say that everyone on welfare is there because they're lazy. And you can't say that everyone on welfare is there just because they're down on their luck. It's got to be a combination. The question is to what percentage, right?
Right.
So, but I think that the welfare system, unfortunately, creates a rut that's very hard for people to get out. And it's not because they can't get a decent job, because I think, to your point, or you're an example of someone that didn't have a great job. You're working at the Jamba Juice and maybe some of these very low paying jobs, but you went out there and made it happen. I don't think that's the problem. I think that the welfare system creates an incentive structure that's just like the government agency that incentivizes people, and generations for that matter, to stay trapped within that system because they think that there's no way out. Right. And I think that, so on net balance, I think it does a lot more damage. Now, that said, I think, if we're talking, I would prefer to get rid of the welfare system, but if you had to have the welfare system, I would actually prefer a UBI. But under the caveat that you had to eliminate welfare. See, what Yang likes to do, and this is one reason that I was really hard on him on his campaign. I'm not really hard on that many people, but sure. I really kind of went after him because he was trying to claim that his vision was similar to Milton Friedman. And that really irritated me because Milton Friedman is one of my favorites. And I felt as though he was misrepresenting Milton Friedman's views to an extreme degree. And Milton Friedman liked the idea of UBI, but he liked it to replace welfare. See, then what you're doing effectively is you're reducing the size of government. You're reducing bureaucracy while maybe helping the people that might still be in need. So I think that's a better alternative. But again, see, no one can go out there and do that, or it's hard because you have so many of those entrenched interest groups that really survive on the entire welfare system, not only maintaining its current level, but also growing into the future. A lot of politicians have the power they have just because they've promised a certain group of people that they're going to get more and more free stuff. And I understand that some people are on hard times, and as a society, we need to help those people. But if you just continue to promise people free stuff just to gain political power, that puts us on another slippery slope where we just don't want to be. It's not how the United States became such a great nation, was by providing welfare. The United States became a great nation by people like you coming in that had nothing. They didn't have a penny to their name, and there was no welfare. There was no benefits. There was no education, state education at that time. Nothing. You just came here and you had to make it happen. And if you didn't make it happen, you're done. Either you're going back to your country or you're homeless. I mean, you've got no other option
Right.
but
Right.
to succeed. And
So
that's a great motivator.
yeah, I mean these are incredibly powerful points. I would say if you had to build within the realm we are now, specifically,
Yeah.
would you prefer people be required to work or go to a future school as a condition or maybe a choice of being a welfare recipient?
Well, I don't know that I want to require them. I think living within the parameters we're in right now, as far as what would be realistic, I think the future school is a fantastic idea, combined with a very, very low UBI that eliminated the entire welfare system. That's probably where I'd go with that, because if the problem there though is that once the politicians get a taste of how many votes they can get by upping the UBI, let's say from $1,000 a month to 2,000 to 3,000 to 5,000 to 10,000, that's what they're going to do if they feel as though that'll get them the votes and get them the power that they desire. And then you just go down a path that takes us right back to where we started, to where we've got all these problems again and all these economic distortions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking now. It's about. See, you've got about 33% of Californians receiving Medi-Cal, which is a style of state support for Medicaid. For welfare, it looks like you've got about 12% of California's population.
What about Section 8?
I'm sorry.
What about Section 8?
Section 8. I'll pull that up. What's your opinion on Section 8 with your real estate background?
It's the same thing. One side's going to argue that it incentivizes people to stay in that system, and that they destroy the houses. And I have seen that firsthand, where the people just destroy houses that they have under Section 8. And then I've also seen people that it really helps them out in a time of need. So there's no 100%. This is the way it is everywhere. You've got to determine, of the 100% of individuals that are on Section 8, how many of those fit into the category of people who are just kind of hard on their luck, and they're really out there working. They're doing everything that they can to get out of the system. And then what percentage of people fall into that category? Then what percentage of people fall into the category that they're just going to keep working the system over and over and over, and it's going to turn it into a generational thing where they have no respect for themselves or respect for the house. I'm sure that you and I could go back and forth with these horror stories of guys that we know and gals that are investors in the Section 8 housing scheme, and it can get really crazy.
Well, it's certainly one thing that I strongly believe is that by having this massive housing shortage, we have to have rent control, Section 8, specifically in real estate. If we had more houses, we'd have at least the option of lower priced homes somewhere. You wouldn't necessarily need, and I'm not saying just tomorrow abolish Section 8 or rent control, not saying that at all, but you wouldn't need the programs anymore, because now all of a sudden people could move. If they wanted to and maintain their payment, they can move. But you go to LA right now, there are people paying $1,300 in rent for something that should be renting for $4,000 a month based on the way the current market is. Not saying that it should be $4,000 either, but that's just the current market rate is $4,000. They're paying $1,300. Why would they move? And so now the initial impression is, oh, well, that's good. I mean, look how much the government is helping them. It's helping them basically maintain that affordability there. Well, fine. So they can live there. But the downside is, what are they not doing? They're not building wealth. They're not getting into homeownership. The biggest opportunity to build wealth is not part of their livelihood, because we already know. I mean, the New York Times, plenty of studies on this. New York Times did a recent report. Average net worth of a tenant is somewhere around $5,500. Average net worth of a homeowner is over $175,000. It's non-comparable. And so people are trapped on these systems. And part of it, I think, goes originally back. I mean, so much comes back to the future schools. That's why I think there's so many systemic issues in California nobody's doing anything about. But nobody gets educated in that kind of finance. You know, what I just said might be the first time people have even heard those statistics.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's one of the reasons why your YouTube channel is so popular, is because people are not learning this in school. I'd like to point out that rent control is a price control. And what's ironic is whether you're an Austrian economist or a Keynesian economist, the one thing that they pretty much all agree on is that price controls are bad. And when you have price controls, it leads to one thing and one thing only, and that's shortages of whatever you cap the price on. So if you want there to be a shortage of housing, just go ahead and put rent control on it, and that's what you'll get. And that's exactly what you see in California.
I actually, you know, I hear, and this is anecdotal, but I hear people say that they have properties throughout California, and they can't obviously live in all the properties at the same time, that they'd love to do maybe short-term rentals or whatever, or even 6-month rentals, or even put somebody in for a year because they don't plan to use the property the next year. This is anecdotal. They're suggesting I'd rather not rent it out, because if I rent it out one time in this area, I have to report to Santa Monica, let's say, as an example, and now I'm subject to rent control, and I can never get that property back. It's now stuck. It's stuck in rent control. So just leave it vacant. There you go. There's a shortage. I want to ask you about this. There's a lot of talk right now about, and broader market here, but also relates to this, a lot of talk right now about how potentially this inflation that we're seeing now is very similar to what we saw in the 50s and 60s, which 50s after the Korean War, low inflation, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4. But then in the early 60s, we start getting these wage price controls and price controls to keep a lid on prices.
You got that early 70s.
Right, and then you get this explosion of inflation that started in like 68 into the early 70s. Then you get off the gold standard. You see this explosion of inflation because of all these shortages. How similar is that then to what we're seeing now?
That's a good question. So it's similar in the sense that what creates consumer price inflation is an increasing supply of currency units, in this case dollars, chasing the same amount or a fewer amount of goods and services. That's easy for everyone to get their head around. They get it. The complex part of the answer comes in how is the currency being produced or created. Okay, so back in the 1970s, as an example, you did have the government that was increasing the money supply through a variety of different ways. But then you also had the commercial banking system that was coming in and doing their part. So if for your viewers who might not understand this, usually in a modern economy, the group or the entities that create the money supply are the commercial banks. So when a loan is created, a bank is basically effectively increasing the money supply. So if Kevin takes out a loan for $1 million, let's say, that's $1 million that did not exist before.
Right.
So that's new currency creation. Those are new currency units, right? So back in the 70s, we saw the banks were really lending heavily. This created a lot more of those dollars in addition to the government. And then you had a big psychological shift as well. Psychology is very, very important, where if people assume that prices are going to continue to go up and up and up and up and up, it's a lot different than deflation. A lot of people think that if we have deflation, then people hold off on their spending. I don't think deflation in consumer prices really affects consumer behavior, but I think inflation does. And so if we get all these, higher prices, then people start to trade their currency units for goods and services, mostly goods, because they stock up. Why not buy a bunch of water now and just keep it in the garage, because I know if I go back to Costco next month, the water is going to be let's say 20% higher. right? So that's the psychological component. So now what you have, which is different, the commercial banks aren't creating as much of the additional money supply. They're lending a lot less than they were back in the 1970s, okay? Which is traditionally, again, I want to be very clear, that's traditionally in a healthy economy how new money is created in a modern economy. It's through additional loans being created, okay? Everyone gets that. Now, the amount of loans being created by the commercial banking system going down, but M2 money supply, which I'm sure you've pointed out on a lot of your videos, went parabolic in 2020, right? It increased by over 20% broad money. That is a staggering amount. So how did that happen with the commercial banks themselves creating fewer amounts of dollars? It was because the government was spending $5 trillion into the real economy through the deficit spending with all the stimulus packages, and the Fed was monetizing the debt. It goes back to that process we talked about earlier. See, if the government did $5 trillion of deficit spending in a normal environment, they would just extract $5 trillion from the real economy and then just spend it back into the real economy. So on net balance, it would be the same, because the entities and individuals that are buying the bonds at auction are people like you and I in the real economy. Therefore, the bank deposits go down, and then when the government spends the money back into the economy, the bank deposits go back up. On net balance, it's a wash. But again, that process where the Fed monetizes, the Fed buys it with newly created money, for lack of a better term. I'll keep it simple. And therefore, when the government spends it, it increases the overall money supply. So my point is, yes, we are seeing some similar phenomenon that we've seen in the past, but this time the entities that are creating the additional currency units are different and motivated by different incentives. That's for sure.
So what tell me about those incentives, because I mean, it seems like banks would be continuously motivated to keep expanding. What's to say, Biden says, you know what? We've lost a lot of public support for this infrastructure plan. We're not going to be able to get some of the tax changes we want through reconciliation. We're going to do a $1 trillion package. It's not going to be $4 trillion. And now all of a sudden inflation expectations start inflecting down, and the borrowing goes down and slows down. Isn't that a potential scenario? Because you don't have that incentive for Janet Yellen to say, let's keep doing loans, because that's more loan fees for us, right?
You got to ask yourself what happens in addition to what you just outlined.
Okay.
So in that scenario, the stock market crashes.
Why?
What's happened is back in 2008, we started this thing called quantitative easing.
It's infinity now.
That's my point. Right? When they first started QE, it wasn't QE1. It was just QE.
Just QE,
They're supposed to only do it once, right? But then what happens? You do QE2, QE3, QE4. Don't call it QE. Remember Powell came out and said, this is not QE, QE. And now we've got QE infinity, basically. Why is that? Because you're building the economy around the financial economy, first of all, is now completely driving everything. So the real economy is really the financial economy supports the real economy, and it's not vice versa like it should be, right? So what happens is you've got all of this this support to the financial economy, right? If that support is taken away, and remember, the financial economy gets built and addicted, I think that's a better word, to this quantitative easing. Therefore, if you take away the quantitative easing, what happens? What happened when Powell did QT, quantitative tightening?
We're not very happy. Do you remember the end of 2018?
Yeah, because see, it's like a monetary heroin. That's the example my buddy Schiff uses all the time, and it's a great description that you're building the financial economy around this monetary heroin, and that's supporting the real economy. So if you take away the heroin, the whole thing crashes. Now, what's happened?
I got to ask you, though. I mean, right now, one of my beliefs is that one of the reasons, I mean, in addition to shortages, okay, we know we got shortages up the yin-yang here. But in addition to that, there's a lot of fear that on Wall Street that, wait a minute, we got all these shortages. It's obviously causing inflation. On top of that, we have Biden potentially spending $4 trillion, another $4 trillion. And then on top of that, more taxes, by the way, right? So if that that creates a lot of uncertainty and fear in the market, like, oh no, if let's say those taxes went away, nothing changed with taxes. They said, you know what, we're not going to spend as much. We're only going to spend $1 trillion instead of $4 trillion, which is still a lot of money. Don't get me wrong; it's still a huge package, right? Doesn't that create more potential certainty in the market, and maybe buoy the market rather than crash it?
Yeah, but where does you got to look at the liquidity, the capital flows, right? Where's the money going to come from to make the stock market go higher?
I see what you're saying. Okay. So I suppose that would depend on how much money people are keeping on the side from the latest sell-off, or if that money evaporated.
Druckenmiller came out with a great chart the other day on CNBC, and it was retail sales have shot up by 15% above their trend line pre-COVID. And that has never happened before. In fact, going back to the GFC, it took us 6 years to get retail sales or retail spending up to the point it was prior to the crash in 2008, right? So with what happened in 2020, retail sales went back up, not in 6 years, but in 6 months. And then, because of all the government support and money printing, we've seen retail sales go up past that point 15%. So why is that a problem? Because usually retail sales go up by 3% per year. So what we've done is we've taken the next 5 years of demand from the future and brought it into the present. Okay, so why is that a big deal, George? Because if you look at the capital flow from foreigners, because this is part of what you're talking about here. Yeah. Usually when you have a downturn in the market or a huge crisis, you see all of that capital coming into the United States to buy what? Treasuries, which are basically long-dated dollars. Okay, but Druckenmiller point out that in the first time in his 40-year career, going back to March and April of 2020, the foreigners stopped buying treasuries to the degree they were buying before. And it was in a pandemic. We had all these problems, market crashing, yet foreigners not bringing those dollars into the system. Then what they did is they rotated. So then who has to buy the bonds? The Fed. That's how they might have to monetize, which creates more dollars, which creates all the inflation that you're referring to. Okay, but what did they do? Then they started bringing those dollars back in, but they bought all the tech companies. They bought growth stocks. But what happens when you have interest rates go up because of the inflation at the long end of the curve? As you know, there's a rotation from growth to value. Well, those foreigners can get great value stocks and buy great value in their own country. They don't need to come to the United States for that. What they come to the United States for is tech. So you have fewer dollars or less international demand for dollars, while at the same time, you have all of the increase in spending. You have fewer goods and services, you see? And that's why the government is in this conundrum where if they don't continue to create the currency to continue to increase the asset bubbles or the stock market or whatever even higher than it already is, then the house of cards comes crashing down because they've built the system around the QE and the stimulus in the first place. But if they do that, then the yield curve most likely goes up. But then what happens? Fewer dollars come back in. The release valve is the dollar. And that's why you're seeing the DXY go down. So my point is just to say that there are a lot of moving parts right now, and the money spigot cannot be turned off. It would be too detrimental to the financial economy, therefore the real economy. So most likely they're going to have to figure out a way to not just maintain the current level of stimulus, but to do more and more and more and more, just like we saw them do with quantitative easing. And I think that's what takes us into a central bank digital currency.
It's interesting because really you have this $120 billion of bonds that are being bought monthly by the Fed.
Right.
And we know these markets are stable. We know they don't need this extra support in the sense that, like, functionally they're stable. But what you're saying is, sure, maybe functionally they're stable, but if you remove that support, you potentially now have a collapse that comes from a different angle.
Because there's no buyers. There's no buyers. So what happens to the 10-year and the 30-year? What happens to mortgage rates?
Rates skyrocket.
Buying 80 billion or 120 billion per month. If, to Stan Druckenmiller's point, the foreigners are no longer buying those bonds. He said the trigger, the catalyst, was the CARES Act. Once the government announced the CARES Act, foreigners that usually buy those dollars in the form of long-dated bonds said, we're done. We're done. We're not buying any more bonds because we're worried that we're going to be paid back with devalued dollars.
Sure.
Because they see the writing on the wall when the government comes out with a $4 trillion stimulus package, and they know that the U.S. economy is now addicted to the stimulus, just like we're addicted to the quantitative easing. So I think what happens if the Fed steps back and doesn't monetize the debt, doesn't buy those treasuries at auction from Janet Yellen, then you see the long end of the curve just go up even higher than it has gone up. What does that do to mortgage rates? It shoots them through the roof. The real estate market comes down. That's a big component of purchasing power for the average American. Consumption, 70% of the economy. That goes down. If you see interest rates go up, most likely the multiple given to stocks, what happens, especially growth stocks, those come crashing down. And then let's talk about that, because we were referencing California, which is where you may be the government, so you'd probably have to deal with CalPERS. Okay, well, what is CalPERS doing right now to try to get that 7% return to meet their liabilities? They're sure as hell not going into Campbell's soup or whatever blue chip. No, they're going into all these high flying tech stocks because they don't have a choice. They've been pushed so far out the risk curve by the Fed because of the artificially low interest rates. So if you have the long end of the curve go up, if those growth stocks go down, now all of a sudden it not only crashes the market, it crashes the real economy, but then it also crashes a lot of those pension funds as well. And then what do the states do that are up to their eyeballs in debt already?
Right. Yeah. It's funny too, because the way it's sort of being branded, what you had mentioned from Druckenmiller, is you're maybe not from him, but from others, specifically like the Fed. The way you have this branding going on is that the U.S. economy is now growing at a faster rate than the rate we were on before. So it's kind of like, we were growing at this rate, but now we've kind of shifted up that curve and we're growing at this faster rate.
But in nominal terms, Kevin.
Right. Maybe not in real terms because of inflation, of course. But it's interesting because that's being branded as such a good thing. But in reality, it's just a distortion, is what you're suggesting.
Here's the way that you can put on the glasses to see through all the fog.
Okay.
This goes back to the simple question. You just talked about GDP going parabolic and increasing at a higher rate than trend. Yeah. The only thing I would say is just ask yourself the question. In fact, all the viewers can ask themselves this question right now. Although GDP has gone up, as a society right now in 2021, are we producing fewer goods and services or more goods and services? The answer is obviously fewer. Therefore, I don't care what GDP is doing, we are all poorer as a result.
Wow. That's incredible. So I want to ask you, anything else that you saw in that California plan that you liked or didn't like?
I really love the eliminating the state income tax up to $250. My concern with that is that the majority of the producers that are leaving are making a hell of a lot more than 250.
Sure.
So, and you'd probably know this story a lot better than I do. But why did Musk say that he's leaving? What were the rationale? What reasons did he give? Do you know?
No, I don't specifically recall. I know that there was a phase he went through where he wanted to sell all of his earthly possessions. I remember him saying that. Certainly, so he sold his own houses himself. One of the other things that he had extreme frustrations over was Alameda County and the disaster with Giga Fremont. And one of the things we're seeing now is we're actually seeing the quality of vehicles coming out of Giga Shanghai is substantially higher than the quality coming out of Giga Fremont in Alameda County, partially because of the regulations that limit Tesla's ability to improve or expand their facility.
Right. So
that's a broader frustration.
Okay. Yeah. So it wasn't really a tax issue as much as it was just
I'm sure
all
that's
these little things that added up.
I think it could be branded as it's everything else, but hey, he knows he's got some big stock-based compensation coming. Where do I want to receive it, right? I mean, let's be real. That's on his mind, but he did not say that, at least from what I'm aware of. But yeah. I mean, what else? I mean,
I think if you just said that we're going to put a freeze on income tax, on state income tax for everyone above 250. So if whatever you're paying right now, guys, don't worry about it. If you're making $5 million a year and you're creating a lot of jobs, I can't promise you that I'm going to lower your taxes, but I'm at least not going to raise them anymore. And I think that would be a step in the right direction, as well as eliminating, below 250.
The current, at least proposal, which I'm very enthusiastic about, is over 250, dropping the rate from this insane 11 to essentially 13.3, 13.4%, dropping it to some sort of flat rate between 5 and 7.
At least that's competitive. I mean, that's you're Arizona right there. So at least you're in the realm of
much more competitive. I really liked what you said about California being competitive with other states, something that the federal government doesn't have. And right now, California is losing that competition. We're the laughing stock of the country. I mean, just yesterday, Governor Abbott in Texas was making fun of California on Fox Business, and it's a daily occurrence. But the problem is, you listen, and it's like, what he's saying is not wrong.
Yeah.
It's tough. That's tough. So, okay. Well, thank you. This has been incredibly insightful. Anything else that you want to add, and how can people get in touch with you, George?
Well, I just want to say, I think what you're doing is absolutely fantastic. And I don't know that I've ever been more impressed with a young individual than just following what you're doing on YouTube. And now what you're doing in trying to become the governor of California. I mean, my hat's off to you. I think you're doing an amazing job. It's inspiring for us old guys to look at the millennials, that I make fun of in my videos all the time. But to see millennials like yourself going out there and really taking the bull by the horns, and with your level of ambition, your integrity, and your work ethic, it just gives me a lot of optimism for the next generation that's going to maybe come after me. So thank you very much for doing what you're doing, and keep doing more of it. We need more Meet Kevins in the world, and especially in the United States, and definitely in the state of California. As far as where they can find me, George Gammon on YouTube or Twitter or anything like that. It's just my name. You'll find me probably too much on the internet. That's all you need. It's GAMMON, and I'll pop up everywhere.
Your insights are so good. I love it. And what's so wonderful is you really give critical insight. You give folks things to think about. And you do that in your videos. You've done that in this interview and our other interviews. It's really, really good. I mean, thank you. Seriously. I mean, and not just for your kind words, but also, for the critical thinking and the perspective. So thank you for that.
I appreciate it. I appreciate it. I'm glad someone's out there watching the videos. I really still to this day, I'm sure you're in the same boat. It's really hard to believe that people actually want to watch something that you produce and put up there on the internet. But I'm very thankful for the support.
It can be very, very surreal. So thank you so much again for everyone watching. If you found this video helpful, subscribe. Go subscribe to George Gammon as well on Twitter and YouTube. Go find him. I did also retweet your tweet from the beginning of the show, so thank you for that. So if you follow me on Twitter, it'll be an easy way for you to follow George. And wow, thank you again so much. George, stand by for a moment for everybody else. Thanks for being here. Share the video, subscribe, and we'll see you all in the next one.
All right.
Thanks again.